Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another video, and today I'm going to be showing you the differences mainly between the iPhone 15 Pro Max and iPhone 14 Pro Max, with some mentions as well in the details of the iPhone 13 Pro Maxes. Alright, so for the iPhone 15 Pro Max, it boasts a slight redesign with the titanium frame, which offers a lighter yet durable feel, compared to the stainless steel frame of the iPhone 14 Pro Max. This detail, by the way, I did mention in my last video where I unboxed this phone, but in case you just didn't catch on to that, I'm just going to mention that again. Remember the action switch I mentioned? Well, from the 14 Pro Max, that didn't exist. You had, of course, just the mute switch, which I'm really glad that they added the action switch, because, you know, you have the button controls already, especially if you use it on the side, like sideways like this, perhaps when taking photos and whatnot. This button can really come in handy. So the iPhone 15 Pro Max has some slightly thinner bezels, which makes it have a slightly higher screen-to-body ratio compared to, you know, the 14 Pro Max. So from the 14 Pro Max, I mentioned this in my previous video, where there was of course still the Lightning port, but because of laws in the EU, Apple decided to finally make a change and make the cable for iPhone's USB-C. Although this year's most top-end phone for Apple weighs slightly less than last year's top-end iPhone, unless you hold them side by side, you don't actually feel much of a difference. Even as I'm holding it, I have to be a little bit let's really think. And to prove it, the spreadsheets and whatnot show that this is 221 grams or 7.8 ounces, and this is 240 grams or 8.47 ounces. Both phones feature a Samsung-made OLED panel, which is very interesting because, you know, Samsung and iPhones, they compete with one another for the smartphone market globally. But both of these phones do have a 120Hz refresh rate and a peak brightness of 2000 nits, making them really ideal for HDR content. I talked about the A17 Pro processor for the new iPhone 15 Pro Max, which is very interesting because it's actually 3 nanometers and offers up to USB 3 speeds, which is really fast compared to what they had last year. Also with ray tracing, GPU, 10% faster CPU cores, and machine learning assisted upscaling for improved gaming performance. When it comes to the screen size, resolution, and ProMotion refresh rate, they're basically just the exact same for both phones. So something new about the A17 Pro is that it's the world's first 3 nanometer chip, which of course can process a lot of stuff, and that's ridiculously small. Technology has really come a long way, especially in Silicon Valley, where they've recently started making things smaller and smaller and smaller and able to process so much technology. This A17 chip can process up to 19 billion transistors. That's what I meant by the power of technology has really come a long way since the 1960s, and it delivers an 18% higher boost in operations per second compared to the A16 Bionic chip from the 14 Pro Max. Both of these phones still process the same 48 megapixel main camera sensor, except the 15 Pro Max does enhance image processing, promising better details and also improved low light performance and more accurate skin tones. The iPhone 15 Pro Max is more distinguishable with a new periscope zoom telephoto lens, providing 5 times more optical zoom and up to 25 times software zoom, surpassing the iPhone 14 Pro Max's 3 times telephoto lens and 15 times total digital zoom. The iPhone 14 Pro Max would usually by default shoot photos at 12 megapixels, but this year they've jumped it up to 24 megapixel photos by default. The haptic feedback for both phones remains pretty consistent between both of the models, which offers precise and satisfying tactile responses. When it comes to sound, they both have excellent stereo quality, although there are some slight minor adjustments to the EQ curve for the speakers, which can, of course, enhance the listening experience. The energy-efficient A chips in both models ensure commendable battery performance, with the iPhone 15 Pro Max expected to match or exceed the endurance of last year's 14 Pro Max. Specifics for charging remain identical, of course, besides the fact that, you know, this had a Lightning port and this had a USB-C. There's still going to be a 20-watt wired charger and a 15-watt MagSafe support, and both models are going to be compatible with the upcoming QI2 chargers. So of course the chips have gone from 4 nanometers to 3 nanometers for the A16 and A17, But the only other main difference between these two phones, I think, that you will notice, and that I have noticed looking at the specs, is that this has 5 times optical zoom, but last year's had 3 times optical zoom. Alright, let's talk about the current phones that are still being sold in the Apple Store. So you still have the iPhone SE, which I think it's been in the store for years, honestly, and the regular iPhone 13, the regular iPhone 14, iPhone 14 Plus. Notice that there's no Pro or Pro Maxes for the iPhone 14 that are currently being sold, because for the Pro and Pro Maxes, they recommend that you buy the iPhone 15 ones. And of course this year you have the regular iPhone 15, iPhone 15 Plus, iPhone 15 Pro, and iPhone 15 Pro Max. The iPhone SE, smallest at 4.7 inches, is $430. The iPhone 13 is $600 at 6.1 inches. The iPhone 14 also has 6.1 inches in terms of its standard size at $699. For the iPhone 14 Plus, that's $799 at 6.7 inches. Here's something interesting. So the iPhone 14 Plus and the iPhone 15 are both worth $800, except the iPhone 15 has less screen size than the iPhone 14 Plus at 6.1 inches for the iPhone 15 compared to the iPhone 14 Plus. The iPhone 15 Plus is $899 at 6.7 inches, and the iPhone 15 Pro is at $999 at 6.1 inches, and of course, the most expensive of them all, the iPhone 15 Pro Max, is at roughly $1,200 at 6.7 inches. And a quick side note about the prices is that the more storage you want for the iPhone that you're going to buy, the more it would cost. So for those of you who have noticed when I was going over that previous section, there was no mention of the price for the iPhone 14 Pro Max and iPhone 13 Pro Max. That's because they are not being currently sold by Apple themselves. However, at certain phone provider locations, you could possibly get it for a deal for both of these phones. And for all the prices I mentioned, when I use the term dollars, I'm referring to US dollars, not dollars from other locations in the world, specifically US dollars, because in other locations where they use a dollar, it's probably more expensive. Both the 13 Pro Max and the 14 Pro Max have, stainless steel with a texture matte, and also with the glass on the back as well. And of course, they don't have the action button on the side, they still have the ring/silent switch, which of course, because the action button is new, and yeah, that only belongs to the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max for the action button, and also the iPhone 15 Pro Max only has a titanium textured matte glass on the back as well. The iPhone 13 Pro Max, they have an A15 Bionic chip. This is the 13 Pro Max. Has the A15 Bionic chip with a 6-core CPU, 5-core GPU, and all of them have the 16-core neural engine, all of these three, and all of them also have the 6-core CPU, except the iPhone 15 Pro Max has a 6-core GPU instead of the other two, which have a 5-core GPU. So about the chips, for some reason the A17 actually says A17 Pro, which is a very interesting detail, which I only just realized looking at the specs now. But for the other two, they don't mention Pro, it's just A15 and A16. So these past few years have had a pretty big jump in terms of how the cameras would work. So you have the 13 Pro Max with 12 megapixels for the main ultra-wide and telephoto. But for the 14 Pro Max, there's the 48 megapixel main ultra-wide and telephoto. And for the 15 Pro Max, you have also, for the most part, mainly 48 megapixels, but you can also have super high resolution photos for the 24 and 48 megapixel ranges. For portrait mode on all three of these iPhones, the 13 Pro Max and 14 Pro Max do have just a portrait mode with focus and depth control, but for this year's 15 Pro Max, you have next generation portraits that you can take, which I think is really important for those who really want those good crispy images from. So all of them have 0.5 times optical zoom, except they also do have 1 times optical zoom. These two both have 3 times optical zoom, but the 14 Pro Max last year also had 2 times optical zoom, And instead of 3 times optical zoom for this year's, it's 5 times optical zoom, which I think is pretty impressive. If you're considering switching from last year's phone, which is the 14 Pro Max, to this year's 15 Pro Max, I'd say the only reason why you would need to do that is if you really want to have the USB-C speeds and also the USB-C cable, which of course allows you to charge and connect multiple devices. So for that in particular, me personally, if I was someone who actually had this, I would definitely switch, especially because you've got the action button on the side now, which allows you to do many different things, which you can of course set up, and then it's just a whole new creative world what you can do. And also, for those of you that don't have last year's phones but you have iPhones from the years before, I especially would recommend this year's phones, because you can also try out the dynamic island and just see how useful it can be and allow you to multitask. And of course, because you have the A17 Pro chip. Pro. That's 3 nanometers. 3 nanometers and fits 19 billion transmitters. I'm just bringing that back from what I previously said in this video because I honestly think that is insanity. Especially with all the boosts that have come to portraits and whatnot for this year's phones. That's another reason why I strongly recommend buying this year's phone. If you don't have a phone with a dynamic island or a phone with 48 megapixel cameras, which I just described last year's phone, then I strongly recommend getting this year's as well, with the extra boosts in power capabilities and USB-C ports, which were not from last year. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this, although these videos only come out like once a year for the new iPhones and sometimes the new watches.